Gary was already awake when Rex arrived at the cave with a newspaper and a confused expression. The headline said China had become the second largest economy in the world. Rex looked at the headline. Then at Gary. Then at the headline again. He asked how a country that was extremely poor just a few decades ago had built itself into an economic giant that rivaled the wealthiest nations on earth. Gary looked at the newspaper for a long time. Then he said this one was going to need several chapters. And that some of the chapters were going to be uncomfortable. Rex said he was ready. Gary said good. Because the comfortable version of this story was not the accurate one. Chapter 1. Where China started. To understand how China got rich, Rex needed to understand how poor China actually was not long ago. In the 1970s, China was one of the poorest large countries on earth. The average income was extremely low. Food shortages were common. A large portion of the population worked in agriculture and produced barely enough to survive. The economy was centrally planned, meaning the government made virtually all economic decisions. What to produce? How much to produce? What prices to charge? Who worked where? This system had produced decades of stagnation, mismanagement, and in some periods, outright famine. Rex thought about the Cuba chapter. Gary said yes, it rhymed. But then something changed. And what changed was a decision made by one person in a position to actually implement it. Chapter 2. The decision that changed everything. In 1978, a leader named Deng Xiaoping took effective control of China and asked a question that echoed something Rex had heard before. He asked what actually works. Not what is ideologically correct. What actually produces results. His answer was pragmatic in a way that few Communist Party leaders before him had been willing to be. He began opening parts of the Chinese economy to market forces while keeping the political system tightly controlled. Special economic zones were created along China's coast. These were areas where foreign companies could invest, build factories, and operate under rules closer to capitalism than communism. The experiment worked. Dramatically. Factories opened. Jobs appeared. Workers who had been farming for subsistence wages moved to cities and earned more than they ever had before. Gary said this was the hinge point. Everything that followed grew from this single structural decision. Rex thought about Sheikh Rashid asking what happens after the oil. Deng Xiaoping asking what actually works was the same kind of question. Uncomfortable, pragmatic, and transformative. Chapter 3. The Factory of the World. Through the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, China became the manufacturer for almost everything the rest of the world consumed. Electronics. Clothing. Furniture. Toys. Steel. Chemicals. Machinery. If Rex picked up almost any object in his cave and looked at the bottom, there was a reasonable chance it said made in China. Rex asked why companies chose China specifically. Gary said several reasons stacked on top of each other simultaneously. Labor was cheap. Hundreds of millions of workers were available and willing to work for wages far below what workers in wealthy countries demanded. The government made it easy for foreign companies to come in. Tax incentives, simplified regulations in special zones, and active courting of foreign investment. Infrastructure was being built aggressively. Ports, roads, rail lines, and power plants appeared faster than in almost any country in modern history. And the scale was unlike anything the world had seen before. China did not just have cheaper labor. It had hundreds of millions of cheaper workers, which meant it could produce at volumes that no other country could match. Rex thought about the banana analogy. When one tree produced bananas, it was valuable. When China produced 10,000 times more of something than anyone else, it changed the price of that thing for the entire world. Chapter 4. What China did with the money. As factories multiplied and exports grew, China accumulated enormous amounts of foreign currency, primarily US dollars. Rex asked what China did with all those dollars. Gary said this was one of the most strategically significant financial decisions of the modern era. China bought US government debt. Enormous amounts of it. This kept the US dollar strong and the Chinese yuan relatively weak. A weak yuan made Chinese exports even cheaper for foreign buyers, which made Chinese factories even more competitive, which produced even more dollars, which were used to buy even more US debt. Rex recognized the loop. Gary said this one was not bad. At least not obviously and immediately. It created a kind of economic symbiosis. Americans bought cheap Chinese goods and borrowed money. China produced those goods and lent the money. Both sides of this arrangement had reasons to continue it. And it continued for decades. Rex asked if this was sustainable. Gary said that was exactly the question everyone was now asking. Chapter 5. The infrastructure no one has ever matched. While China was building its export economy, it was also building something else. Physical infrastructure at a scale and speed that had never been seen in human history. More miles of high-speed rail were built in China in 20 years than existed in the rest of the world combined. Cities of millions of people appeared where farmland had been a generation before. Ports that became the largest in the world by cargo volume. Bridges across distances that seemed impossible. Highways connecting every corner of a country the size of a continent. Rex thought about Dubai building infrastructure before demand arrived. China did something similar but at a scale that made Dubai look small. Gary said the difference was that China had a government that could make decisions and implement them without the delays, legal challenges, and political opposition that slowed infrastructure projects in democratic countries. Rex asked if that was good or bad. Gary said it depended entirely on whether the decisions being made were good ones. When the decisions were good, the speed was an enormous advantage. When the decisions were bad, the speed meant that bad decisions got built at enormous scale before anyone could stop them. Chapter 6. The parts that were not capitalist. Rex had been nodding along assuming China had simply become a capitalist country. Gary said stop there. China's economic system was not simply capitalism. It was something more complicated and harder to categorize. The Chinese Communist Party retained control of the largest and most strategic companies in the country. Banks, energy, telecommunications, transportation. Private companies existed and thrived. But they existed in a system where the party could intervene, direct, or shut down any company it chose, whenever it chose. Foreign companies that entered China often had to share their technology with local partners as a condition of entry. This transferred knowledge from global companies into Chinese hands at an accelerated pace. Intellectual property from foreign firms was used, copied, and developed into competing Chinese products. Rex said this sounded like the system was not entirely playing by the rules. Gary said this was one of the most contested and politically sensitive aspects of China's rise. Western governments, businesses, and trade organizations had raised these concerns repeatedly and formally. The Chinese government disputed many of these characterizations. The debate continued. Rex sat with the complexity for a moment. Chapter 7. The debt nobody talks about. Gary said there was a part of China's economic story that did not get enough attention outside of economic circles. Rex asked what it was. Gary said debt. China's extraordinary growth had been fueled not just by exports and investment but by enormous amounts of internal borrowing. Local governments borrowed to build infrastructure. Companies borrowed to expand. Property developers borrowed to build cities. The property sector in particular became one of the largest parts of the Chinese economy. And much of it was built on debt. When the property market began showing signs of serious stress in recent years, the scale of the problem became visible. Some of the largest property developers in the world, Chinese companies, began defaulting on debts measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. Empty apartment buildings sat in cities where demand had not materialized the way projections had assumed. Rex thought about this. Infrastructure built before demand arrives could work. But only if the demand eventually came. Gary said that was exactly the risk. And China was currently living inside that uncertainty. Chapter 8. The Apparent and Apparently Rich. Rex remembered the title of this video. Why China is Rich. Or Apparently Rich. He asked Gary what the apparently meant. Gary said it was honest. China's aggregate economic output, meaning the total size of its economy, was genuinely enormous. Second largest in the world by most measures. But the average income per person, when spread across 1.4 billion people, remained significantly below the levels of wealthy countries like the United States, Germany, or Japan. China had produced enormous national wealth. That wealth was not evenly distributed. A relatively small portion of the population, in major coastal cities and the business elite, lived comparably to wealthy country standards. A much larger portion of the population, particularly in rural areas and inland provinces, lived on incomes far below what Western media images of Chinese prosperity suggested. Gary said this was the part of the story that often got lost. China was rich in aggregate. China was not universally rich in the way that the headline numbers implied. Rex thought about the shiny postcards of Cuba's Havana before the revolution. The inequality hidden behind the surface image. Gary nodded. The pattern appeared in different forms in many stories. Chapter 9. What China still has to figure out. Rex asked what challenges China faced going forward. Gary held up several fingers. The property debt crisis was real and unresolved. The population was aging rapidly and the birth rate had fallen significantly, creating long-term labor and pension challenges. Relations with the United States and other Western economies had become significantly more tense, with tariffs, technology restrictions, and supply chain restructuring all making the export model harder to sustain. The middle income trap was a genuine risk. Many countries grew quickly to a middle level of development and then struggled to make the leap to wealthy country status. China was attempting that leap and the outcome was not certain. Political control of the economy created efficiency costs and discouraged the kind of risk-taking innovation that wealthy countries relied on for long-term growth. And the zero-COVID policies of recent years had caused significant economic damage and social disruption that continue to affect confidence and growth. Rex listened to the list. Gary said none of these meant China would fail. They meant the next chapter was genuinely uncertain. Chapter 10. The Actual Answer. Rex asked Gary to summarize how China actually got rich. Gary counted. A pragmatic leadership decision in 1978 that opened the economy to market forces while maintaining political control. Hundreds of millions of low-cost workers available at a scale no other country could offer. Government policies that actively attracted foreign investment, technology, and manufacturing. Strategic currency management that kept exports cheap and competitive for decades. Infrastructure investment at historical speed and scale that made production and logistics efficient. A willingness to use every tool available, including ones that trading partners considered unfair, to build industrial capacity. And time. 40 years of consistent direction, even when the methods were controversial. Rex looked at the list. He thought about Haiti. About Cuba. About Venezuela. About Dubai. Some countries asked the right questions early. Some never got the chance to ask them. Some asked them too late. China asked a specific question in 1978. What actually produces results? And then spent 4 decades finding out. Gary picked up his banana. Rex folded the newspaper. The headline about the second largest economy no longer looked like a surprise. It looked like arithmetic.